All right, folks. For our next session, we have Rafae, who will be speaking to us about cybersecurity meets generative AI. Please post your questions to Slido if you have it during the talk. We'll try to see if we can go over them after the session is complete. And over to you, Rafae. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate all of you being here for the last talk on the last day of the conference. And I recognize I'm standing between you and your journeys back home, so let's get started. Quick show of hands, how many here in the audience are related to a GRC function? All right, and how many here are just because they're AI enthusiasts or just because there's AI in the title of the talk? All right, this pretty much sums it up. Okay, so let's get started. Here's a brief outline of what we're going to be covering. I'll give a little bit of background about myself and why the idea of Copilot and why now. And as part of that, we'll cover the state of the audit today. And then we're going to get into the architecture of a potential agentic AI approach that we could use to address some of the challenges. It's still pretty much, work in progress, so it's not something that's ready to use right away, but it's an approach, and these are the building blocks that could be leveraged to get there. And then the demo here is just to kind of give you a quick instantiation of what that approach might look like. It's kind of like in a very early stage, but just kind of give you an understanding of like what it might look like when it's fully baked. So we'll kind of cover that so that we can all get an appreciation for what this architecture looks like when we try to implement that. All right, so just a little bit about myself. So I've functioned in technical, advisory, and operational roles in various Bay Area startups with a decade of experience in building compliance programs. So understand a little bit of the pain points when doing compliance audits. Recently, I also became an attorney. So I'm licensed as an attorney in California, and that kind of gives me the understanding of what regulatory compliance might mean from a more rigorous standpoint of, being subject to different obligations. And these days, the audits are kind of getting, a way for companies to attest to their compliance obligations, even from a regulatory standpoint. For example, you have a HIPAA appendix to an audit. You could have like GDPR set of controls that are part of your audit. Anyone in the audience who has experienced that, where there's a HIPAA component to your SOC 2 or GDPR component? Yeah, so I see some hands. So that's why this whole regulatory, like the rigor that comes from like a regulatory standpoint, and adding that to the rigor that comes from an engineering standpoint to actually do the tasks that are required to perform an audit, they kind of go hand in hand, and this trend is only going to increase with time. I'm currently also serving as a CISO at a fintech startup in Silicon Valley, and I have a blog where I provide legal advice. But just a disclaimer, this is my own independent pursuit in thought leadership and not tied to the work that I do at my company. So let's talk about why we are here. Let's talk about audits. So essentially, the idea of a compliance co-pilot is the background is that today the path to audit-ready controls goes through professional services, and a significant amount of time is spent on manual process. Now, a true co-pilot would reduce our dependency on that process, right? And what I mean by an audit-ready control is it is mapped to a specific test. So for those of you who know, what happens in an audit, like there's always a test that you have to pass, and you have to provide some evidence that you passed that test. And there are 2,000 of those, right? So you just repeat that process 2,000 times. Not really, but feels like it. So getting to that audit-ready control is the goal here. Now the path to get there, right? So that's the nirvana, but the path to get there still sucks, right? Even if there are billboards on 101 that tell you otherwise. But there are two talks that happened earlier today that kind of made it easier for me to make that case, right? So one is actually a talk by Varun, who gave a talk on GRC engineering. If you missed that, you should go watch the video when it comes out. But he made the case that, basically we need engineers to kind of, we need to work on tooling to help engineers hate audits less, right? And then that pretty much sums it up, that GRC still sucks. And then there's another talk like, okay, what's the AI component? Why is AI the relevant thing to solve for it? The keynote by Caleb in the morning, which basically talked about, the top 6 trends that CISOs should look into, should be focused on. And compliance was there in that list. And he also talked about the 3 C's, and one of the 3 C's was context. So as we go deeper, we'll see how that plays a role here, because this is about synthesizing the information in your organization and putting that context to use. So how do we go forward from here? Well, for that you have to answer one question. Do you want to take the red pill or the blue pill? The blue pill is blissful ignorance, and we can pretend tools are going to be fine, we don't have a problem, and we don't put AI in the mix and let it take care of itself. The red pill, however, means that this is a painful reality of where the automation is today and where it needs to be to really call it automation, right? So what does it look like to take the red pill? So here, if you notice here, I have outlined the key stages in an audit and the level of automation. Think of it as the charge, right? This is the amount of charge that the automation provides us for all these stages. So the first stage is to kind of map out your controls. And today, the tools do provide you a tentative list of controls, but that list needs, someone to review it to provide you the canonical list that works for your particular environment. So that's like the manual process, right? That's a 20-80 split there. You install a tool, it produces a list for you, but you need to make sure that is the list that you need to run with, right? You can start to implement those controls, but you need to make sure that those are the right controls for you to implement. Similarly, if you have multiple frameworks, the tools are getting much better here. So if you have multiple frameworks, they are going to do the work to map, overlapping tests to the, similar controls. They're going to do that. However, you still need to validate that the mapping has been done correctly. So I would say that's about 50-50, but there's still a big lift that the tool can provide you there. So if you're dealing with multiple frameworks, at least you got like half of your work done. But remember, the remaining half is validation that needs to happen. Similarly, with the tests, the tools are getting a lot smarter. So for example, you could integrate your GitHub, and you could integrate your AWS, you could integrate your other repositories. Wherever there's an API or a plugin opportunity available, the tools will help you figure out the test and say, hey, grab the encryption settings, grab the password settings, right? Grab the branch protection settings. The tools can do that, but again, it requires a manual pass to say that, hey, this is the correct thing that you need to do. The evidence is where it sucks again, right? Because the tools that I mentioned earlier, the ones that have an API connection, it's only about 20 to 25% of an audit. Sadly, like the remaining 75% is all documents. It's like your board meeting minutes, it's like your code of conduct, it's your disaster recovery policies. They are not automated today. And that's like a huge subset of what's required for the audit, and that's part of the company state. And sometimes you kind of go into like, the rabbit holes of like Slacks, emails, calendar invites, back and forth, communication, just to gather that kind of evidence. And then lastly, we run out of charge when it comes to, the reviews, right? Like when you've submitted all your evidence, then you're kind of just waiting like 2-3 weeks for the CPAs to do their due diligence. And that's a CPA only work today, but we'll talk a little bit about the Gen AI opportunity here, which can help automate at least the drafting process of that report. It still needs a review by like a partner, at the audit firm. But the whole process of like putting that report together, there's an opportunity there to automate that. So if we think about it, right, like from start to finish, we are spending like maybe 2 to 3 weeks in control mapping, 2 to 3, further week in validation, 2 to 3 weeks in evidence testing, and maybe like a couple weeks in the report generation phase. So we are probably at around, 2 to 3 months from start to end. Multiply that with the number of audits you do a year, and you could be, stuck in this cycle pretty much the whole year. Now the approach is, like that the tools have, you could automate a lot of the evidence collection, but again, the remaining part is really hard to automate. And why is that hard to automate? I mean, there are two things. One, you might say training data. Yes, I mean, training data is a problem because you are not going to find data about like an organization's internal repositories that, you could basically use to tune the model. But that is not actually the hardest one, right? The hardest problem is domain expertise. So the need for domain expertise here is the barrier to entry. As far as the data itself is concerned, I mean, the policies, there are only so many templates, right? The disaster recovery policy, incident response policy, it can only differ in so many different ways. So is the evidence for, okay, what comprises a code of conduct, what comprises, whether or not the board of directors met. That is that is something that is within a small, universe of permutations that exist for that data. And so it is manageable to be able to fine-tune a model to recognize that, am I looking at the correct type of evidence, right? So from my standpoint, the harder problem to solve is the domain expertise, because a successful co-pilot will have to mimic how an auditor thinks, how a compliance professional thinks. So essentially, I'll have to just clone myself, for example, if I'm that professional. Now that, I believe, is the hard problem to solve. And then obviously the generative AI aspect, which is that if you have a document that is missing, the co-pilot should be able to provide you a template that this is the template that I created for you. This takes into account the state of your organization. Just review this and make sure that there are no missing details. So that is another big step that needs to happen. So if you compare the blue pill versus red pill, right? So today the process is people intensive. What if you take the red pill and start putting AI into it, what you'll move towards it being resource intensive. Today it's about information gathering and kind of gathering the documents from different repositories. With AI, it's more about knowledge retrieval, because that knowledge, as we saw in the keynote, is already there. You need to synthesize that knowledge in your organization from your organization repositories and make sure that it can be retrieved to apply to that particular test and the evidence requirement. You move from gap identification to gap remediation. So after 3 weeks of gap assessment, you get a report or a spreadsheet that says, hey, you are missing these policies. And then you kind of engage another resource just to kind of draft those policies. That is an overkill, right? So this model could advise you that, okay, you're missing this policy, but by the way, here's the template for this policy that is already pre-populated based on your organizational state. And then whether or not evidence actually meets your particular test requirements, that is also something that can be validated, because a lot of times when you're going back and forth with your auditors, they are saying, hey, I see this email for the board meeting, but it doesn't have the list of attendees. Or I see this email for the board meeting, but it doesn't really, mention whether this particular topic got discussed or not. All of these are things that can be, you could use fine tuning for, and you could basically say that, these are the kinds of things that the correct evidence should have, and you could at least take the first pass of that evidence and put that in the audit ready bucket for somebody's review, versus just waiting on someone to kind of do the first pass manually. So those are all the things that could happen through smart validation. Again, it's not completely automated validation. There's human in the loop, but it's smart validation because it's assisting the human in the loop. And then lastly, you move from a world where you do audits ad hoc to a world where they are repeatable. So again, that 2 to 3 month cycle, and then having to do that like 4 times a year, it just gets a lot more efficient if you don't have to spend that much time and that much money every time you have to go through the audit. Because remember, there's knowledge retrieval happening, and the audit requires the tests and the evidence required for multiple audits often overlap. And so you get the benefit of being able to leverage that across multiple audits. Okay, so now that you can make a decision to take the red pill or the blue pill. So if you take the blue pill, we accept the status quo and don't move forward, or you remain in the room and we take the red pill. Okay, so what does that look like? Imagine that you are going through your SOC 2 audit, and you are asked to basically provide. You need to know what level of compliance do you have with your applicable obligations given your profile, right? So as an input, you would tell the model, just like you talk to ChatGPT today, right? You will say, hey, I'm a SaaS company. I'm in the healthcare industry in the US region with EU customers, and I accept payments, right? So simple prompts that you use today with a chatbot. So you provide that, your profile, and then this model will also be preloaded with your existing state. That state would be, what I was alluded to earlier, the context in the 3 C's, right? It knows about your policies. It knows about your, ticketing provider. It knows about your human resource vendor or the tool that you're using, because those are some of the common things, right? Your organizational charts, your support tickets, your identity management, your cloud provider. These right there, and your internal document repository. These right there are the 5 systems that are the key to gathering evidence. So it has your profile, it has your state, and imagine a world where you would ask the question, what is my level of compliance with the applicable obligations? And the output would be, these are the controls you're fully satisfying. These are the controls you are partially satisfying, with an explanation of why you are partially satisfying them. Remember the board meeting example? For example, your control may be missing the number of attendees, or your control may be missing like a particular area that did not get discussed. Or whether you are not satisfying. So for example, it retrieves your encryption setting and it says encryption is set to false, right? So those are the things. But again, what makes it hard is that our criteria has to be really, really high. Our criteria of accuracy is that it has to meet that of a compliance professional, okay? So here are a couple examples. I'm running out of time, so I wouldn't dwell too much on this, but essentially the goal will be to retrieve an item from a particular source. So for example, if it's asking for information security roles and responsibilities, the test would be, hey, retrieve your role-based access control matrix from the policy DB. And the reason it knows that is because it has scanned policy DB and it knows there's something called role-based access control matrix. And it has been trained to state that, okay, it contains the information that is needed to satisfy this control. And there's really no need why this cannot be, this piece cannot be done, because every year I go through this audit, I do the same thing. I go to the policy DB, grab the role-based matrix, and attach it. That's it. That's what I do every year, without fail. The second example here is related to unique IDs for information systems and networks. This is very close to what existing tools can do for you. However, exactly what setting to retrieve is a question that is a decision. that needs to be made. So your auditor or your compliance professional would have said that, hey, go grab the IAM policy setting, and then the rest the tool does. So in this case, the agent should be able to make that decision because it knows that in that particular file, it's going to find what's needed to satisfy the evidence. And then the next step is to apply the success criteria. And again, remember, this is about decision making, which tools don't do today. So let's say your control says upon termination, the access is removed. It grabs the access review ticket because it understands your environment, and then it looks for the success criteria, and then it says, yes, the ticket has been closed with a comment that access was removed, or some other way that indicates that it has been removed. Same thing with encryption at rest. That's an easy one. Yeah, all you have to do is look for a Boolean. But here's an example where it automatically will validate that. It's not just like, hey, I retrieved it, I'm going to put it in the queue for someone to look at it and then come back to me in 2 weeks. Yeah, you're good. No, you're going to get that decision right away. So the big picture, these are the requirements that you need to follow, right? It's easier said than done. So I do want to emphasize that these are the requirements that we need to follow here, which makes it challenging. So you need to be able to produce a canonical control list. You need to be able to produce and validate the control mapping. You need to be able to produce and validate the tests for those controls. And then you need to be able to retrieve the documentary evidence and then remediate the gaps. So these 5 requirements in a nutshell are the big challenges that potentially agentic AI could address for you. But hey, I'm not saying this is done, but this is a starting point of the discussion that we could start to think about that. So in the limited time that I have left, I'll just quickly go over, the architecture and the demo. So essentially what I've tried to do is I've tried to use the 3P framework from AWS to kind of put this in perspective, right? So it's a play, pattern, and primitive. What's our play? We are displacing the service with software, and we are targeting high volume, high value work. What's our pattern? We have a compound AI system that uses AI agents and RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation. We perform model innovation using fine tuning, and then we have an LLM wrapper for prompt engineering. And our primitive, in our case, it says Bedrock there because it's AWS, but our primitive is GPT-4. I'll probably just run through this really quickly because most likely, the majority here would already know what retrieval augmented generation is. But just in a nutshell, you're able to load the current state of your organization by creating embeddings and putting that in a vector storage. And then at the time of retrieval, you are able to respond to the queries that takes into account the state of your organization.
In other words, creating your own knowledge base.
That's exactly what that is. And so, for example, an HR database, ticketing database, email database, that all comprise your knowledge base, and it gets you create embeddings and it gets stored in a vector DB. And then runtime, you can also retrieve system settings to kind of address the encryption and other kind of questions as well. I'll take a few seconds just to talk about the fact that we need to make sure that we are also performing what's called the human feedback, like reinforcement learning through human feedback, to avoid any biases and making sure that the model is actually producing leaning towards making the correct decision. Because again, decision making is very sensitive. In this case, it's not as sensitive as, profiling and, other kinds of situations where you're approving, applications for things that affect your fundamental rights. But in this case, it's still decision making. So you want to make sure that you take more correct decision more often than not, right? And particularly with certainty, right? So that's where you want to be. Just a quick thing about why AI agents. So essentially, this is why everybody is excited about AI agents. At least that we can picture highly proficient agents enabling important work to get done far faster than today. So I just wanted to say that because to mention that because it's not just something that I believe is going to happen. It's something that, I think the industry generally is kind of leaning in that direction, is going to happen. And so this is one of the problems that's going to enable for us. So our components are, for RAG plus AI agents, we're using LangChain. That consists of a model and a repository of standard controls and descriptions of company-specific documents. We are using GPT-4. We tried some other models, but GPT-4 gave the best results. We're using FAIS as our in-memory storage. Zero-shot inference is what we are, zero-shot approach is what we're doing for prompt engineering. I really want to get to the demo, so I'm kind of skipping through this a little bit. This is the agentic architecture. And again, remember the key things here is the rigor of our traditional compliance and the power of generative AI, right? So we have this agentic architecture. So we have a compliance repository. We have embeddings from the control documents that get stored in a vector DB. And then we have these agents that perform gap analysis against the different evidence documents like the policies, the vendors, and all the other kinds of evidences. And then we have the organization's policy documents that kind of feed into that. So this is kind of the architecture that we could use to implement this. And now, coming back to our initial question, right? This is the question that we wanted an answer for, that you're a SaaS company in healthcare industry, US region with EU customers that accepts payments. So your co-pilot should be able to recognize that SaaS maps to SOC 2, healthcare maps to HIPAA in US. Having EU customers means it immediately maps to GDPR, and accepting payments means PCI. So without having to go into the acronym soup, just in a natural language, the user says that this is my profile, tell me, my level of compliance. One, it should be able to understand the applicable regulations and frameworks, and then produce a list of controls that is relevant to your environment, and then retrieve the evidence for those controls, and then give you like an answer how much of these controls you're meeting fully, how much you're meeting partially, and how much you're not meeting at all. So, for example, SOC 2 has somewhere around 147 different controls, right? And so this is what you're going to be faced with if you're dealing with, let's say a SOC 2 audit, and you need to make sure that this is the right list for you. You need to make sure that list is tailored to your environment, right? So that's, if it takes that much to scroll, imagine how much it takes to actually go through. This is HIPAA, right? We have 50 controls for HIPAA security. And then we have another 75 for HIPAA privacy, right? This is not easy on the eyes. I understand that. That's part of the motivation, right? And then you have PCI. It has 367. I'm not even going to wait for that. So here's what we did, right? So you're Acme Corp, you upload your data. You have the option to specify, the control frameworks, but it will get that on its own even if you don't. You put the systems that you're using, and then it'll spit out the controls that, apply to you. So in doing so, it already took into account the overlaps between HIPAA, SOC 2, and everything. So for example, this is, these are the SOC 2 controls and the remaining are HIPAA controls, but it already accounted for the overlaps for you. And then in the next stage, it's going to check the compliance for you. So we only did it like partially just to give you an idea, not for everything. But let's say that if you are partial, it will tell you, okay, what is the reason that the model determined that you're partial. So that is essentially where we are. I think that leaves me like 50 seconds to just show you the screens. So this is the control mapping where you kind of set up the tool, you kind of create the agent, give it the prompt, and then this is the evidence testing where you have the different rules, and you kind of give the prompt, and then the agent responds by telling you that these are the reasons why certain evidence does or does not meet particular requirements. So the next steps here could be, you want to scale this for production use cases, trying to use smaller LLMs that can be deployed securely, moving from an in-memory to like a proper vector database, incorporate advanced prompt engineering methods, and also incorporate generative techniques so that you could create policy templates. But like I said, this is just a start, right? This is just a way for us to move from what's compliance today to what compliance could be with AI. And here's a link to, here's how you could reach me on LinkedIn, and there's a blog post that describes that, but that's what I had. Happy to have any questions if you have.
All right. Let me
I'm sorry?
the question.
Not yet, no. It's not like in a format right now where we can let people, completely depend on it, so we're still working to make it more reliable.
Did you use Party Rock or Bedrock for the control mapping and to be able to surface that, or tap into the knowledge base to be able to do faster control mapping? I was just curious.
So is your question whether...
You used an AWS tool to do that?
Yeah, no. So we actually used LangChain plus GPT-4. We use that combination. I only use the 3P framework from AWS to kind of just provide the perspective of like the plays, the primitives, and the patterns. Like that's just a clean way to organize this thing conceptually. But we didn't use AWS tooling.
Right. Any other questions? Right.
Yeah. The slides will be posted.
Slides will be online in a few weeks.
Slides will be posted online. And then this blog post here also kind of goes over, basically describes the architecture and the problem and the solution. So it's a written version of what I talked about, yeah.
Online at BSidesSF?
Yeah, if you go to BSidesSF, you'll see the recording as well on YouTube. Yeah.
I'm in the Bay Area, yeah. Yes, I do. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for staying.
All right. Thank you.